Thank you everyone for joining us today for our winter lecture series, In Their Own Words, and tonight's lecture, Life in a Small Town, Reverend Lyman Beecher's Reflections on East Hampton from 1798 to 1810 by Richard Behrens. My name is Marianne Delacroce and I will be your moderator this evening. And please join me in welcoming our lecture series chairwoman, Barbara Borsak.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you popping up on the screen, your names. I was thinking as I was watching you come on, what I really miss is getting the opportunity to chat with everybody before the lectures and after the lectures. That's the hardest thing this year, I think, not being able to see you in person. But thank you all for joining us. And I think you're going to enjoy this second in our lecture series this winter called In Their Own Words. Tonight, we're very privileged to have one of the true treasures, I think, of East Hampton share with us some of his insight into early life in East Hampton as seen through the writings this month of Lyman Beecher. Reverend Beecher was the minister in East Hampton during the years of 1775 to 1863, and he lived on Main Street, not far from the town church, which at that time stood right near where Guildhall is right now. Lyman Beecher was one of a number of well-known men who ministered in this little village of East Hampton. And we're very happy tonight to have the curator of the East Hampton Historical Society to share with us. So please join me in welcoming our very own Richard Behrens. Richard?
Thank you very much, Barbara. You're too kind. I think one of the things that fascinates me, particularly about a community that is as old as East Hampton, is that we have so many centuries that we can go back to, but there's not really a lot of rich journals. And there certainly were not a lot of autobiographies written by many people, particularly in the 19th century out here, if any. So I think we're very lucky that Lyman Beecher had really fallen in love with the village, and many years later decided to write his memoirs and included some very interesting pictures of him. He certainly was a character, and certainly his vision of a little bit about the history of the community, but also a lot about just what he did in those 10 years. And I think you'll be surprised. So tonight, I'm going to use the words of Reverend Lyman Beecher as I read selections from his autobiography and also some letters. And they almost all pertain to 1798 to 1810, which was his tenure out here. On August 27th, 1843, Lyman Beecher and his two sons, both born here, both ministers, returned to the village of East Hampton to preach to an overflowing crowd in the old 1717 church. It was a celebration of faith and friendship. It was also a nostalgic event that inspired him to start working on his memoirs. What I've done is sort of piecemeal. They're certainly chronological, but they don't necessarily go into make a total story. It's more like a patchwork quilt, and I hope that you enjoy what we found. Can we have the first image, please? Remember, I'm talking as though I'm Mr. Beecher. This is Yale University about the time that Beecher was a student there. I was born in October of 1775 in New Haven, Connecticut. I grew up on a farm with my father, David. He could lift a barrel of cider and carry it into our cellar. He was a blacksmith like his father before him. He made the best hose in New England. He was one of the best read men in New England. And he was well versed in astronomy, geography, politics, and he read the New Haven newspaper every day. He taught me to be a blacksmith. We always had Yale students and members of the state legislature as boarders, and my conversations with them and my father's astute arguments got me thinking and talking in a very broad, worldly way rather than a boy in a country setting. My Uncle Lot asked me once if I wanted to go to college, and I replied, I don't know, sir. The next day, he asked me again, do you want to go to college? And I said, yes, sir, I should. My father agreed, and Uncle Lot helped me, and I entered Yale in 1793. Now, it was back in 1798 that I just graduated from Yale and was headed to see my family and friends at Guilford, Connecticut. I stopped at a halfway house for dinner and absentmindedly picked up a newspaper and saw a notice that Dr. Buell had died. I had heard of Dr. Buell, a very famous minister, for many years, particularly from my uncle, who had come over to East Hampton and heard him preach several times. Uncle Lot said that he would leave the pulpit and he would go to the galleries in the church and talk to the awakened as people swarmed and screamed and got excited about the reawakening of religiosity in East Hampton in the 1860s and 70s. I thought to myself, well, they'll want a minister there now. They're never going to hire me, but they did. An old friend, Tudor Davis, told me later that their first choice didn't set well with the young people here, and they wanted to get more young people into the church, and that he was sent out, in quotes, to find a man who can stand his ground in an argument and break the heads of the infidels. I set sail on the New England ferry. Mr. Mulford from East Hampton met me in New London, and we came over to East Hampton. It was an exciting moment for me to think while I was on the waters that I was crossing over the waters to my first parish. Let me tell you a little bit about my new home in East Hampton. The main street is part of the main highway, and you can put a new slide on. It's almost 10 to 16 rods wide. And what you're looking at here is an astonishing, the oldest known pictorial village of East Hampton, done between 1806 and 1810. It's a theorem, it's a watercolor on velvet using stencils. And if you look closely, you'll see the buildings. There's a couple of buildings on the left-hand side. Then there's a gambrel roof building, and that's the Miller House. There's another, and then there's the building with the dome, believe it or not, is how the students saw Clinton Academy. And then there's two very large buildings, another Miller House, and then a Gardner House, and then of course the windmill, and across from Clinton Academy is of course the 1717 church. Now this was done by an unknown student at Mrs. Beecher's school. And we'll hear more about Mrs. Beecher's school at the time. But we have a couple details of this because it is really the most astonishing document of what our community looked like, you know, just about 1806 to 10, which is when the school ran. So the road is 10 to 16 rods in width. It's lined with the plainest farmhouses standing directly on the street with wood piles by their front doors, and the barns close to the street also, often right on the street. There's a windmill at each end of the street. There's so little traveling that the road consisted of two ruts worn through the green turf for the wheels and two narrow paths for the horses. Another image, please. The wide green street is generally covered with flocks of white geese, and those you saw in the first image. The only trees in the village are lines of poplars that are between the private residences. And you can see the lines of poplars there, certainly lines of trees. And the principal tree is a large elm, and it's had such an enormous height. It was trimmed up ahead, and it was a conspicuous landmark for miles around. These were hardly any trees anywhere but in the village. Next slide, please. And this is one that shows you the church, shows you the steeple, and certainly shows you the windmill up on top, which is now in the collections of the East Hampton Historical Society, and a gentleman with a top hat all dressed in black. Who knows? It could be Reverend Beecher. Next slide, please. On Sundays, all the families from the small villages around came riding to meeting in great two-horse uncovered wagons with 3 seats carrying 9 persons. It's possible that more than half of the inhabitants make no other journey during their entire lives. The minister was a bit of a snob. This is a very rare photograph of the 1717 church, probably taken a few years before it was demolished. So it's probably dates from the late 1860s to probably 1770. The church was demolished in 1871. Next. I was invited by a friend to travel the road to Montauk Point along the white sand beach of Napeague, and surely one of the wildest in nature, and one well calculated to leave a lasting impression upon a mind such as my own that was always susceptible to grand and sublime, not so much to beauty. On the north of the road are wild islands which are covered with bushes of beach plums. Along the shore are rugged cliffs at whose base the surf beats with uncommon violence. The sweep of the ocean seems unbroken, with calm being very rare. The view as I rode along the solitary shore is unimpeded over the land as far out upon the Atlantic as you can see. Next slide. Another part of my new parish, and certainly the oldest settled, is Gardner's Island. And this is a drawing of Gardner's Island, the manor house, probably in the 1870s, but pretty close to what it would have appeared to Beecher when he was visiting on the island. The island is separated from the rest of the town by a bay of 3 or 4 miles in width. It was named for the first proprietor, Lyman Gardner. His descendants have continued to hold it and have been leading influences on the parish. The estate is owned by the 7th of the series, a man of education, refinement, and celebrated for his fine fondness of antiquarianism, particularly researching the history of East Hampton. His society naturally was attractive to a young minister like myself. Next image. And accordingly, the island's large and hospitable mansion was ever one of my favorite visiting places, and no sermon of mine was ever thought finally ready to print until I had submitted it to the inspection of my friend John Gardner. And this is looking out from the 17th century burial grounds at Gardner's Island, looking across the bay. Next. I was given my post before I had been ordained. It wasn't until the 5th of September, 1799, when I finally was ordained at Middletown, Connecticut, where one of the examiners came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you think it would have been better had you chosen a good, sound congregational church rather than a Presbyterian?" My reply was, "I cannot ride 2 horses at once, one this way and one the other." After a short return to East Hampton, I went home to Connecticut to be married. I had been engaged to Roxana Foote for 2 years. We were both 24 years old. No one ever married more heart and hand than I. Next. After a day or 2, we packed up. Roxana had a small amount, a candle stand, a bureau, table, clothing, bed linens, and stuffs enough for herself. Uncle Benton hired a small sloop to take us over the Sound. We went immediately to Judge Miller's house, and this is Judge Miller's house on Main Street, a photograph probably from about 1875. And after a week at Judge Miller's, we then stayed with Aunt Phoebe Gardner. Next slide, please. This is a wood engraving of the church in East Hampton. Once again, just about the time of Lyman Gardner, not a lot of changes. The illustration is probably from the 1870s. And here's an interesting quote from Beecher. "I have preached 7 or 8 times a week, the whole winter of 1799 to 1800. Last week, for example, I preached twice in town with 2 lectures besides. I also had to go to Gardner's Island for a funeral service, 5 sermons to the Indians and the white people down in Montauk. I have weekly lectures at some of the villages adjoining, Wainscott 4 miles away, Amagansett 3 miles away, Northwest 7 miles away, and the Springs, and it is the Springs with a capital the, 7 miles. Some weeks it's 2 or 3 of these places, and when not at these places, there are meetings both afternoon and evenings, sometimes even in the forenoon. Now, to get a better vision of what it might have been like for his wife, we're lucky to have a number of letters. So this one is November 15, 1799, and it's Roxana writing to her sister back in Connecticut. I find it difficult to get letters to you. We live 7 miles from Sag Harbor. I cannot go daily to carry letters. As for Mr. Beecher, he is everybody's man. I have spun enough for 2 pairs of stockings and almost knit them, and have mended my own and my husband's clothes. The uncommon attention to religion has brought a great deal of company. Indeed, there have been somebody here the greater part of every time. We have not passed above 1 or 2 evenings without visitors, and they commonly stay till about 11. So I find it difficult to seize a moment to write. I have been presented with nearly 70 runs of linen yarn by the young ladies of the town. I should have a fine piece of cloth once I get it woven. Next. This is the pulpit at the 1770 church, which was probably installed by Reverend Buell in about 1750, 1760. And this still survives. It's in the collection of the Historical Society. And it's astonishing that a fully carved pulpit, which would have stood about 12 feet in the church, survives. And it's interesting, we know that it was made in Connecticut, and it's been illustrated in many books on Connecticut architecture because it's one of the few surviving mid-18th century pulpits. Next slide, please. So this is the house that I bought in the spring of 1800. I bought it with 5 acres for $800 with help from the church. It's a 2-story frame house, shingled instead of clapboarded on the sides and gable ended to the street. He would make that note because the majority of houses that he would have known back in Hartford would all have been weatherboarded, not shingled. I laid new pitch pine floors. I built a new fireplace, finished the back rooms and chambers, and a small bedroom below. Repairs cost me $300. There was no store in town. All our purchases were made in New York by a small schooner that ran once or twice a week. We had no carpets. There was not a carpet from end to end of the town. All had sanded floors, some of them worn through. Roxana introduced the first carpet to East Hampton. Uncle Lot gave me some money. I had an itch to spend it. I went to a vendu, which is the word for an auction, and bought a bale of cotton. Roxana spun it, had it woven. Then she laid it down, sized it, and painted it in oils with a border all around with painted bunches of roses and other flowers over the center. She sent to New York for her colors and ground and mixed them herself. The carpet was nailed down to the floor and was just installed on the floor on the parlor door when someone came in, knocked on the door. It was old Deacon Talmadge. He came to visit. He stopped at the front parlor door and he seemed afraid to come in. He looked at the carpet, all shiny and new. And I remember saying, "Walk in, Deacon, walk in." He replied, "Why, I can't walk in without stepping on it." Then after surveying it a while in admiration, he said, "Do you think you can have all that and heaven too?" interesting, the Beechers took that as a compliment. Current historians think that it was not a compliment at all. Right. Next slide, please. Mine was the first orchard in East Hampton. People here had the impression that fruit would not do well so near the salt air, and they laughed when they saw me setting out trees. Once the orchard was thriving, they decided to set out fruit trees themselves. We had a front dooryard garden with flowers and shrubs. Others saw this and did the same. The wood piles were cleared away from the street. Some of the barns were moved back, and the place looked prettier on a summer's day than anywhere to be found. This photograph of Clinton Academy, probably taken about 1875. The Academy was built in 1784 with the enthusiasm of Dr. Buell and funding from mostly locals, almost all. I think there was one from Sag Harbor. And it was a remarkable school because it taught both boys and girls. And it wasn't really a school that taught girls how to be wives. It taught them French, and it taught them geography and literature and poetry writing. Boys were often instructed in navigation, but it was one of the first two academies to be accredited by New York State after the American Revolution. So it played a very important part in the community. And here's Beecher's comment. I taught in Clinton Academy for a brief period. It was horrible, a perfect torture. It was just like driving Uncle Lot's old plow, only worse, to sit there looking at my watch 10 times or 8 or 10 times an hour to see just when I could get out of there and get home. So he didn't enjoy his experience at Clinton Academy. I loved East Hampton. I enjoyed getting out, and one day I took my fishing tackle and drove out to 3 Mile Harbor. I dug some clams, then rowed out to the chickweed grounds. I baited my lines and threw them out, and then let the boat drift. The fish would strike, I'd haul them in, row back, drift again. What an easy exercise. Opens the chest, breathing the fresh air. How good it was. I caught a dozen from 1 to 3 pounds weight apiece. Next slide, please. I also tried gunning. Dr. Huntington used to go with me, and we were what locals called net-ups. You may ask, what's a net-up? Out here, it means a crony. He was rather skeptical breed, but we were on friendly terms. We used to shoot plover and snipe. And here's a snipe shooting from the shore, a Curranized print from the 1860s. And the next image is a golden plover, a decoy from about 1860 or 1870. And so these were two things that he would have been hunting with his friend, the skeptical Dr. Huntington. I worked at making turf fences and even did haying. I bought a horse cart and hauled seaweed from 3 Mile Harbor to mix with the barnyard manure for my corn patch. You know, I like a challenge. So I thought I'd go catch sharks. I had been ill for a while, and I needed to breathe the fresh air and build up my stamina. Because of their size and strength, I started by tying a line to my body, but a large shark took me down into the waves so that some neighborly fishermen had luckily been nearby and rescued me from drowning. Henceforth, I tied the line to my horse's whiffletree, so when the sharks would bite, I made my horse haul in the shark. Next slide, please. Now, Beecher was having a little money trouble. You can see that he promptly spent that money, you know, on some cotton for spinning and making a rug that his uncle gave him that he couldn't stand to let it, you know, burn a hole in his pocket. And even though he had, in fact, you know, gotten a raise once, it wasn't enough, certainly not for his living style. So he took an ad out in the local paper, the Suffolk Gazette. The public are informed that a school will be opened in by my family of the subscribers about 15th of June next for the instruction of young ladies in the branches usually taught in boarding schools. such as reading, writing, grammar, geography, and history, needlework in its various branches, drawing, and French language. A number of pupils can be accommodated with board in my own home. Lyman Beecher, East Hampton, May 3rd, 1806. After I'd been in East Hampton for 6 years, our family had grown by 4 children. With my wife, her sister Mary, and a housekeeper, our expenses were multiplying, but not so my yearly income, my yearly salary. It became manifest that something must be done. So to increase our income, and not consulting with the congregation, Roxana and I opened a school. I advertised. The scholars came from towns around from Mid-Island. Roxana and Mary taught higher English, French, drawing, painting, and embroidery. They needed to bring in 2 slave girls to assist them. I helped with subjects for composition. The school prospered, but our expenses continued to rise. Next slide, please. This is an extraordinary yarn sewn rug made by Mercy Hunting, who was a student at the Beecher School. She was 25 years old when she studied there, which she was probably one of the oldest students studying at the school. And she made this rug in 1806. So here's a detail of the rug, where this is the whole rug. And it may not have probably ever been intended to be on a floor. It was probably intended to be on the top of a chest or on top of a table. The next detail shows you how beautifully it's sewn. And this shows you a interesting looking crested bird. And so here's Lyman Beecher talking about it a few years later. I remember how Roxana and Aunt Mary studied Lavoisier's treatise on chemistry together. Chemistry was a new science and a constant subject of discussion and needed to be presented to the students. They tried a great number of experiments too, and sometimes with ludicrous results. I also remember several large pieces of embroidery that were done by her scholars. There are at least 2 surviving, one at the East Hampton Historical Society and one on display in the summertime over in Sag Harbor, which is part of the collection of the, what is it? It's called now Long Island History. Used to be Stony Brook. They tried a number of things. It was pretty clear that embroidery was an essential accomplishment back then. Roxana drew flowers from nature, made beautiful copies from splendid colored engravings of birds, which is probably where this image comes from. Her forte was drawing likenesses on ivory. There were 24 miniature portraits that she'd done of her family and friends here in East Hampton, which she kept in the family as a treasure to be shown to her children when they were very good. Our church had had some powerful revivals under Dr. Buell, but infidelity had gained a foothold here in East Hampton, and an infidels club had been organized. Not very large in point of numbers, but composed of men of talent, education, and an unrivaled zeal. As a specimen of their spirit, a Bible was burned to ashes. On my arrival, I chose not to really attack infidelity directly, not at all. That would have been cracking a whip behind a runaway horse that would just make them run faster. Sometimes we all went out after beach plums, carrying all the baskets, boxes, and bags in the house. They grew so thickly that we gathered them by the bushel. And these, with quinces that we grew in our orchard, were the common table sweetmeats at home. Next slide, please. This is an extraordinary drawing. It's a detail from a 1722 map of Gardner's Island, and it shows some offshore whaling there. So here's Mr. Beecher's experience with whaling. Somewhere about this time, I had a famous whale chase. Going out the door one morning, I saw the weft fly flagging, the weft flying. I kept 3 whale boats always ready, they being the community. And if a whale came in sight, a man went up a mast and waved his jacket of a particular, and had a particular kind of yell. And this signal was, and the jacket was called the weft. I saw the boatman running. I stepped back, caught my hat, said nothing to Roxana, and down to the sea I went. The boats were all full, but 1 seat behind the steersman of the last boat. Without a word, I jumped in, took an oar, off they pushed. Once we came upon a whale. Pull, 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 yelled the captain. And we pulled, but the whale sunk and we overran him. And then we had a long chase after him again. Pull, pull, pull. Our harpooner stood in the bow. Almost near enough, I saw over my shoulder the whale, like a boiling pot just ahead. I longed he would strike the whale so that we could be carried on instead of chasing him, but he took no care of it himself, and the whale sunk to never rise again. So we had the pleasure of rowing back 10 miles to East Hampton. Next slide, please. This is a rare artifact of Reverend Beecher. It's his writing table, or writing chair as they're called. And it was probably purchased, we know it was made by Ebenezer Tracy from Lisbon, Connecticut. So that would be relatively near where he was living. And these would have been made between 1785 and about 1800. On the back of it, it's stenciled with his name, and it has a writing surface. It has a drawer. It has another drawer for writing materials, and it has a lectern that can be moved over. It's on a piece of bent iron made by a blacksmith, so he could sit and write his sermons in this chair. We acquired it last year, and it's really one of our most exciting artifacts we bought in a long, long time. And the arm is so unusual. I mean, it's obviously something he put on. And since he was trained as a blacksmith, I mean, we'll always wonder if he may have been the one who put the arm on. He was quite a character. Here he's telling us about his violin experiences. I had learned to play the violin while at college, and every day practiced the liveliest airs. If the children started to dance, I would make the instrument sound a doleful screech, unless always ending any attempting at dance. My playing was often referred to as monotonous, and those in the household who were very sensitive to my musical defects found my playing annoying. I began using the violin as a wake-up call. I would station myself on the stairs, play over and over some miserable air, till all the delinquents came down in the morning and made their appearance for breakfast. Next, please. I, like Mr. Gardner, was greatly interested in the history of East Hampton. In 1806, I delivered a sermon on the first day of the new year, and that was a general history of the town. It was published by Mr. Alden Spooner of Sag Harbor that same year, and here's one of the few surviving copies of the sermon. This is from our collection and came to us when we acquired the Mulford farmhouse. This is the Mulford's copy of the sermon. Some of the most vivid memories of our early life here are in connection with the ocean. Only a half a mile from the house, whose roar we could hear every hour of the day or night, while we could watch the white sails from our windows. And remember, the house that we're talking about is the somewhat Victorianized village hall. So you can imagine, with all the trees gone, because there hardly would have been any trees behind the house, that they could have at least looked down to see the Hook Pond. I'm not so sure how much of the ocean they saw, but on a storm, you might have seen waves going over the dunes. Sometimes a storm at sea would throw the ocean into a wild turmoil while it was still and clear on shore. On one such occasion, on a bright moonlit evening, the family joined two young gentlemen who wanted to draw us nearer to the site of the magnificent scene. The whole ocean rolling and gleaming in the moonlight like a sea of molten silver. I found my salary, even after receiving an increase from my original $300 to $400 a year in my 5th year, but it wasn't sufficient, particularly because my debts had mounted to $500. The negotiations were arduous. I wanted the salary and I wanted my debts paid off. Though compromise might have been beneficial, might have worked perchance, I had accepted an offer from the First Congregational Church of Litchfield, Connecticut in 1810. Lyman Beecher is generally thought to be one of a dozen leading figures in 19th century American religion. He was a revivalist, crusader against dueling. In fact, his sermon on dueling was so important that he didn't have to pay to have it published. It was published by a group who were against dueling and was considered really one of the main things that was used for New York State to outlaw dueling. So he was a confirmed defender of Calvinist and Puritan orthodoxy. When he was in Boston for a while preaching, they thought that he wasn't strict, that he was really a little too strict. But when he went out to Ohio, they thought he wasn't strict enough. So he also was a major, well, in fact, I think he was one of the two founders of the American Temperance Society and played a major role in the Temperance Society for his entire life. And as he got older, he began to get on the bandwagon, which had been so carefully designed by one of his sons and his daughter, and became more involved in the anti-slave movement. One of his contemporaries said that he was the father of more brains than any other man in America. Among his 13 children, Harriet Beecher Stowe is certainly the most famous as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was not born in East Hampton. She was born in Litchfield after he moved away. Henry Ward Beecher became one of America's most famous ministers. Catherine Beecher, who was a leader in women's education besides starting her own school. Catherine Beecher, who was Edward Beecher, who besides being a minister, was a college president and an anti-slavery author. Isabella Beecher was a champion for the legal rights for women. And Thomas Beecher, another minister, was an advocate for modernization of the Protestant churches, which were not adapting well to urban conditions. They had adapted very well to rural, but not to urban. And that was one of his things that he focused on. Beecher wrote a letter soon after he arrived in Litchfield with his family, having sold his house here and much of his furniture. In fact, we own what is called a linen press, which was made here. It was one of two that he bought. It's believed that they came from the Dominy family, and they were used in lieu of closets to shelve clothing on. Anyway, he wrote a letter to a friend here saying, "Give my most affectionate regards to any of my good people who inquire about me, and let them know that though absent from them in body, I have not ceased to remember them still." And that's an introduction to a very interesting guy, Lyman Beecher, who is probably one of the most famous people who ever lived in East Hampton, interestingly enough. So thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting. And are there any questions?
Richard, I'll start off with a question. Do you think that many people asked after him after he left? After he left?
I think that it was a great surprise to the community that he didn't acquiesce and, take the offer from the church. I think that because he was such a character, obviously, you can tell that he was chauvinistic. he always had the right answer. He was physically fit, could do anything, and did it. That I think they just assumed that he would stay longer, but he didn't. And they contacted him and finally came up with an offer that would have been beneficial, but he'd already signed on to Litchfield. And in reality, though I don't think he told them at the time, he was making substantially more than what their high offer was, that they gave after he had signed up. If you look at some of the writings in the backs of the town records, you'll find funny stories. Some of them, many funny stories from the 19th century are not very funny to people from the 21st century. So you would spend more time explaining them than getting a laugh out of them. But no, I think they missed him. I think they were surprised when he came back in the 1840s. I mean, it was like they were greeting royalty, the president of the United States. And he spoke, well, one of his sons spoke first, then he spoke in the afternoon. And then in the I guess, early evening, his other son spoke. And from what we can tell, it was 7 hours long. And believe it or not, most people who attended said that he was as brilliant a speaker as his father.
So we have a question. And again, if you missed in the introduction, if you'd like to type your questions in the chat box there, and then I'll present them to Richard. What is the provenance history of his writing chair? An exciting acquisition from Carla.
Well, the history is not, I mean, it's very clear, but it's based on the object. So the chair, we know that there were hardly any made after 1800. So we tend to think that he had it when he came here. And he could have bought it used, when he went to Litchfield, but those chairs were very expensive. And the majority of those chairs do have provenance. Now, the back of the chair has Lyman Beecher stenciled on it in 3.5-inch letters. So there's no question about Lyman Beecher having had something to do with it. We think the paint on the chair is probably from about the 1850s, and it's probably the 1860s or 70s when someone chose to identify it as Lyman Beecher's. But the most amazing feature is that on the bottom of it is the shipping label being shipped from his last post in Ohio, and that's where it's being shipped from. And it gets shipped to Boston because when he leaves there, he goes and lives with his son in Boston. So we even have the chair telling us by the label that it was shipped at about the time, well, in fact, it's dated the time that he was leaving and moving back east.
And I just wanted to say that,
no,
I was going to say, for more information about the chair, you did a talk last year as part of our annual meeting, and that's on our YouTube channel. So for more detailed information, you can look there.
It's a wonderful personal thing. And it's interesting that we have also 2 other chairs from 2 earlier ministers who each time was here for preached for about 50 years. And we have a number of items that belong to Dr. Buell. So we have quite a collection of materials.
So Barbara would like to know, did the Beechers stay in Litchfield for a long time, or is that another short stay? And
I would say it was, I'm guessing now, it's something like 12 or 14 years he was there.
Okay. And where was his last pulpit?
It was sort of like returning to where his Roxana dies while she's there. But the kids enjoyed it very much. And interestingly enough, that's an important point because we have Harriet Beecher as a 14-year-old girl scribbled away in the corner of his writing room in Litchfield, describing his exotic chair with the movable platform for writing his sermon. So we have one of the family telling us that he had a chair like this one. So I think, you know, most curators are skeptical. So I'd say 99.9%, it's definitely the chair.
Where was his last pulpit? Like where was his last station, I guess?
It was in Ohio.
Oh.
I think he might have preached a bit later on, but if he preached, it was as a visiting minister. He was head of an academy, a religious academy. And because he was thought a little more liberal than a congregational pastor should be, he was in fact, there was a movement, he was really fired. And in the end, he comes out not necessarily smelling like a rose, but he's certainly not found guilty. But I think he probably didn't visit the Midwest much afterwards.
Natalie would like to know, what was the occasion for Lyman Beecher and his sons coming back to East Hampton in the 1840s?
From what we understand, he was traveling. It's not as easy to put together as you might think, but there's a Buffalo, there's a Rochester, and there is a Elmira visit, from what we can tell, although you'd think that everybody would know that easily, but we haven't been able to clarify it for sure. But the main reason he describes is he really wanted to bring his sons back to see where they were born. He always had a soft spot for East Hampton. And I think that his conversations, he made a note in a letter from Litchfield that he always felt that his conversations with the intelligent men of East Hampton, you know, gave him the ability to stand his ground and support, you know, whatever his position was, because Gardner and Miller and a lot of the other guys out here were very smart. And, you know, they would tackle him on a political problem and they would just have fun debating back and forth. And he felt that his debating and his giving of sermons were so improved by being in East Hampton.
Jackie asked, did people have any particular clothing that was worn to join in the whale hunt, or was it usual to run down to the beach in one's street clothes?
Well, that's an interesting thing that we really don't know. I mean, it's very likely that some oil garments would have been stored in the shacks that were on Main Beach where the whale boats were stored. So you just run and you grab them. They were probably not made to order or made to size. You had to get there fast. And my thought is that they probably came in street clothes and, you know, jumped in their oil suits and went on.
And then can you also put into context what other churches were here in East Hampton at the time that he was here?
Well, that's the easiest question in the world. None.
Oh.
Only the Presbyterian Church, right? It's not until the 19th century that, and remember, during the Revolution, you know, the town of East Hampton supported the church. You know, it was like the Church of England. So, you know, when the roof needed repaired, I mean, it was the town that repaired the roof. That's one of the reasons we have so much more information about the church, the early church, than we do later churches, because it was really on the money on the ledgers of the town. And that's why we know that the first meeting house built here a year after the whites arrived had a thatched roof. Because many people assumed that some of our earlier buildings were thatched, but there is a bill for rethatching the church's roof 10 years after the church was built. So.
Another question, did Beecher study after graduating Yale to prepare for the ministry? Usually would have been privately with faculty and perhaps also served as a tutor.
Well, of course, Yale had a divinity school. So, I mean, when he went to Yale, he was studying to be a minister.
Oh.
And he studied with some of the great ministers of the period. And there doesn't seem to have been a training period. I mean, there's definitely references to, you know, doing some preaching while he was still a student. I think the unusual thing may have been that he was hired before he, you know, before he really had been ordained. But that seemed to be not a problem. But there was a lot of friction in religion during the period from the 1750s to the 1820s or so. By 1840, things, you know, get very toned down and lots of compromises. So, you know, you may have a congregational church, you may have a Baptist church, you know, way later an Episcopal church, a Catholic church. But it's interesting when 1840 is really sort of the great age of accepting the religious revival. And it's that period when Bridgehampton and Southampton build their new Presbyterian churches. We were very partial to the 1717 church. And it took a minister almost 3 years to talk the congregation out of leaving the 1717 church and having a new church built. And then when it was torn down, you'll read in the Star every once in a while, you know, when a building's about to be torn down, someone will always reference, oh, that's like our greatest monument, the 1717 church. So that's probably why we have the pulpit, we have the clock, we have congregants passing, we have pews, we have columns, we have lots of pieces of the 1717 church. We have, in fact, 2 pulpits, the early one from 1770 and another one that was built in the 1840s. So that was a really important structure. And since it was the church for, you know, 2 centuries almost, it was a shock when it was dismantled and torn apart. So.
Barbara would like to know, when did Reverend Beecher die? How involved was he with his daughter, Harriet's anti-slavery movement? You mentioned Beecher had 2 female slaves in his home, and what happened to them?
Well, one thing we don't know is because they had 2 slave girls for the school, we don't know if those girls, I mean, it shouldn't happen no matter what, but we don't know who owned them. He was such a cheapskate. My thought would be, well, he wasn't really, he was a spendthrift, but cheapskate when it came to many things. My guess is that he was probably renting them from somebody because, you know, they wouldn't be in the house all the time. They would just be there, you know, when the school was being taught. But we don't know that. He didn't die here, so we don't have a will with a contents list as we normally would have, which is a real good source of information about slave ownership. What I've read about Uncle Tom's Cabin, Beecher was he was not one of the leaders of the movement for freedom. I would say that he morphed into it. He would have certainly been proud of the book. There's no question about it. He was proud of all of his children. And he was really a wonderful parent. I mean, there are letters later on when the kids are reminiscing about, you know, all the things that they do together. And he always had them, you know, doing things together. But no, it's hard to say. I mean, he was really in retirement pretty much by the time that he died. He was here in 74, in 1874, and I think he died in the 1850s. So. But he never stopped getting involved. One of his sons remembered him as saying, you know, no controversy wasn't good enough for him to step in.
We have one question from John. Why was the church torn down?
Well, I think, I mean, I have my own opinion, which is probably not a very nice opinion. I think that Reverend Meerschaum, who was the minister at the time, I think he saw in his own vision of the 1770 church as being treated as a holy object, being treated as an icon, you know, like a statue of a saint in a church. And I think that he wanted to get rid of that church. He wanted to get rid of that history. Some of it, which of course involves slavery and other attributes that Meerschaum would have been violently opposed to. And he was probably really disappointed that people kept so many parts of the building. I mean, because it really did. It really took a long time to persuade the congregants to leave the church. And to get them to leave the church, he built a small chapel further down on Main Street near where Ralph Lauren store is now. And, you know, pretended sort of to use that as a summer church, but in reality, it was going, even though it didn't hold all the congregants, he was going to sort of keep that. And I think he really forced them into to deciding to get rid of the church. And in Southampton, when they built the new church in the 1840s, they sold the church to Sam Parrish, and he moved the old 18th century church down the street and had a gymnasium and a lecture hall there. And a lot of people in Southampton were not happy. They would have much preferred the church be torn down. They really felt that, which is interesting once again, because truly we shouldn't even call it a church. We call it a meeting house. You know, the church has other connotations, but no, the property was going to be put up for sale. The building was in terrible condition. I mean, Meerschaum made certain that nothing got repaired, particularly a broken window. And so it just was in bad condition. It was torn down. And it sits, the church would have sat right where that modern sculpture is in front of Guildhall. That's where the 1770 church sat. And it wasn't until the 1750s that it got its steeple. And it's interesting, the village was just given a Domini clock that came from California. And on the dial, the numbering on the dial is identical to the dial on the 1717 church, which the clock tower would have been probably by Buell. And then there are numbers on the dial, 1, 2, 3, 4, which give you the date of the clock, when the clock was installed. And one of the Dominis was hired to take care of it. And this clock has the numbers on the side, the exact date that the clock was built. And the clock was a one-hand clock, just like the clock that has just arrived from the 1780s. So we're really tying things together as to, you know, who might really have built that big old clock tower mechanism.
Okay.
I don't think that really answered the question.
No, you did. You gave your own theories. Any other questions? We have time for one more question, if anybody has one. I'll give it a moment.
Well, anyway, thank you very much for attending. I hope that you've gotten a sense of his personality, why he would, you know, always be the big man in the room, even though he was relatively short for the time. He was, I think, 5'6", 5'7". But I think that his remembrance of the community, and particularly the many things he did, how he acquiesced to saltwater so quickly from being a farm boy in central Connecticut, that it just shows you avid thinker, a smart guy. And I mean, the story, my favorite story, which I'd never heard before until I started doing this, is the one about tying himself to a shark bait. He was one character.
Well, thank you, Richard. On behalf of the East Hampton Historical Society, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and providing this wonderful presentation for us. Thank you, Richard, for your support. And thank you to our chairwoman, Barbara Borsak, for coordinating our lecture series this year. And
Marianne, I'd like to thank you for putting this magical thing all together.
Oh, thank you.
All the right buttons and whatnot. So.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and please continue to visit our website, easthamptonhistory.org, for more information about our upcoming events, including our next lecture, When Neighbors Were Neighbors, Character Studies by Cornelia Huntington, 1803 to 1890 from her diary, with Barbara Borsak and Hugh King. That's on Friday, March 26th at 7 p.m. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks all. Have a great weekend.